Welcome back. Our third panel will review U.S. policy efforts to bolster supply chain resiliency, identify gaps in existing tools, and evaluate strategies to address supply chain risks stemming from Chinese overcapacity. First, we will hear from Dr. Monica Gorman, who is a managing director at Crowell Global Advisories. Dr. Gorman will evaluate the effectiveness of the U.S. efforts to address commercial supply chain challenges related to dependence on China. Next, we'll welcome Dr. Bradley Martin, who is a senior policy researcher at RAND, and will focus on U.S. efforts to establish secure defense supply chains and assess whether existing tools are adequate to ensure resilient supply. Thank you both for your testimony. The Commission is looking forward to your remarks. I ask that you keep your remarks to 7 minutes. Dr. Gorman, we'll begin with you.
Thank you, Chair Shmabonian and Chair Miller. Members of the Commission, thank you for the opportunity to testify today on the topic of supply chains and our national security. My name is Monica Gorman, and I'm a managing director with Crowell Global Advisors, the policy consulting arm of Crowell & Mooring, LLP. Until January 2025, I served as Special Assistant to the President for Manufacturing and Industrial Policy at the White House National Economic Council. Before government service, I worked for many years as an executive in the apparel and footwear industry. I managed corporate teams around the world and tackled supply chain issues related to global sourcing and U.S. manufacturing. My testimony today is based on public reports, several of which I coordinated or contributed to during my time in government, as well as observations from my public and private sector experience. More than 5 years have passed since the start of the global COVID-19 pandemic and the supply chain disruptions that accompanied it. Yet those supply chain risks did not materialize overnight. For decades, American companies pursued globalization, which led to increasing geographic concentration of production into the most efficient, cost-effective countries. When the pandemic unexpectedly upended these systems, it revealed critical dependencies on foreign suppliers in key sectors, from semiconductors and pharmaceuticals to batteries and defense-related materials, all of which were years in the making. Nowhere are these choke points more significant than in supply chains running through the People's Republic of China. Pandemic-era disruptions galvanized an unprecedented level of federal government attention to supply chains. In February 21, President Biden signed an executive order that mobilized a whole-of-government focus on supply chain risks and resulted in the publication of 4 100-day reports in 21, 6 industrial-based assessments in 22, and a quadrennial review in December 24. The White House established the Supply Chain Disruptions Task Force to coordinate the federal government's response to immediate supply chain crises and launched the White House Council on Supply Chain Resilience to drive cabinet-level coordination of long-term supply chain risk management. Agencies also recognized the need to institutionalize supply chain capabilities as permanent functions. Dedicated offices were established at the Departments of Commerce, Energy, Homeland Security, and HHS. However, much more needs to be done to institutionalize supply chain policymaking and ensure attention remains focused on structural risks. The cross-cutting nature of supply chain work is hindered by legal, technical, and institutional barriers, which are especially apparent when it comes to data sharing within or between agencies. Challenges also arise when agencies cannot agree on which industries to prioritize or which resources and authorities are best utilized to achieve certain objectives. In fall of 24, Commerce's Supply Chain Center unveiled its SCALE tool, which uses government data to assess current and prospective supply chain risks. SCALE found that more than 38% of U.S. industries source over half their imports from the PRC or Russia, and 71 industries are at least 70% reliant on adversaries for most of their imports. Notable data gaps remain, however, with respect to upstream supply chain dependencies on the PRC. Not enough is known about the base materials, components, parts, and processing that go into final imported products, as well as the imported parts going into U.S. production lines. Most supply chain data is held by the private sector and protected for confidentiality. Policy tools are available to address supply chain dependencies on the PRC, but many, including certain trade remedies, were designed for a different industrial era and are difficult to deploy at the speed and scale needed to address China's non-market policies and practices. Trade data collected according to the harmonized tariff schedule is not as granular as corporate data captured in, say, a product's bill of materials. Technical reforms to the HTS could improve the U.S. government's ability to distinguish between imports of certain kinds of critical minerals or chemicals, for example. Reforms would also allow for more precise targeting of imports of concern with trade actions or tariffs. Because supply chains are run by the private sector, it is crucial that new mechanisms for public-private collaboration continue to be explored. Successful initiatives involving voluntary data sharing, such as HHS's Supply Chain Control Tower, could serve as models for other sectors. Financial markets do not systematically measure and price in the cost of supply chain risks today. Companies do not routinely stress test supply chains against various risk scenarios. So policies that incentivize companies to consider and mitigate supply chain risks with the PRC during the normal course of business, and not just when a crisis hits, would help reduce the likelihood of latent vulnerabilities building up over time. As this commission knows, much has been done to invest in key U.S. industries over the past few years to reduce U.S. dependence on the PRC. That said, domestic demand continues to outstrip anticipated domestic supply. Countering the PRC's dominance underlying many of these industries will require a sustained, multi-pronged strategy that includes not just federal investment, but also tax policy, targeted tariffs, and incentives to scale new and advanced technologies over the long term. U.S. manufacturers continue to face competitive pressures vis-a-vis PRC firms. PRC producers enjoy structural advantages that artificially lower costs and create price pressures compared to non-PRC producers. Countering PRC dominance requires not only supply-side incentives to expand manufacturing capacity, but also demand-side support to assure markets that large-scale investments in U.S. production can be sustained over time. U.S. manufacturing alone also cannot remedy supply chain dependencies on the PRC. The U.S. needs to foster integrated and diversified supply chains, including across borders. Sector-specific agreements with like-minded countries would support more balanced supply chain ecosystems and expand market access for American manufacturers. Ideally, these agreements would incorporate incentives to promote localized manufacturing of upstream components, further reducing dependencies on PRC sources. So functioning supply chains are a lot like being in good health. We tend to take them for granted until a crisis hits. As the pandemic-induced disruptions revealed, supply chains left solely to the design of market forces, particularly when a country like the PRC seeks to dominate global markets, yield dangerous dependencies and choke points that threaten the economic and national security of the United States. It is vital that the federal government proactively utilize all available policy tools and explore new ones to ensure that the pre-pandemic supply chain patterns do not once again become the normal course of business. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Dr. Martin.
Good afternoon, Commission members. I really appreciate the chance to speak with you. Although this Commission focuses on China and its actions, many of the things I'll cover today concerning the United States defense industrial base are primarily the result of actions taken by the United States over several decades. They are the result of long-term trends, the evolving threat environment, and complacency and undue faith in the U.S. ability to remedy shortfalls in the event of a crisis. What might have been true for the United States in earlier eras with respect to ability to react and recover from shocks may no longer be true. Readiness means prior preparation, not faith in the ability to react. This is not to suggest that the current vulnerability is beyond remedy, but to suggest that action is needed. China's preeminence in manufacturing across key elements of supply chains is well known. China has the largest manufacturing sector of any national economy. It dominates international trade, which means it is connected to supply chains around the world. Finding all the places where China directly and indirectly affects critical supply chains is nearly impossible, because commodities pass in and out of China at various stages of the production process throughout it. We do know that China is preeminent in several basic industries, without which other economies would have difficulty functioning. These include, just as an example, the processing of critical minerals, chemical production for industrial, pharmaceutical, and military use, some kinds of microelectronics, and batteries. These commodities are not always at the cutting edge of technology, but they're nevertheless essential. The U.S. government, and in particular the Department of Defense, has to counter this preeminence and try to counter this preeminence in multiple ways. DoD has been proactive in trying to identify areas of supply chain vulnerability, both in high-tech developmental efforts, areas such as quantum computing and AI, and in more routine areas such as chemical production. But with respect to the defense industrial base, many of the shortfalls arise from issues in the broader economy. There may be no way to fix the DIB without fixing broader issues. The United States has historically been able to overcome supply chain shocks by absorbing initial damage and then turning to its civilian industrial base to make up capacity. This approach relied on a large and growing industrial economy with significant excess capacity that could be readily converted to defense production. This favorable situation probably will not be true for future contingencies, very unlikely to be true. And the DIB would have a very difficult time reacting to surges in demand that we've seen in such cases as the war in Ukraine or U.S. operations in the Red Sea, where the demands for ordnance in particular have been far beyond what planners might have projected. Relying on the market to kick up adequate, innovative, and well-supported capability on its own is unrealistic. There are certainly innovative companies and people in the United States, some of whom would welcome business with the U.S. government. But businesses attempting to provide production needed by the United States government still face a challenge that a significant concentration of material, some of it precursor to the finished product, resides in China. Even if agencies could coordinate with every sub-tier supplier, most suppliers could not identify the origin of all the parts in the systems provided. For example, China has a 30 to 40% market share of the world's legacy semiconductors, not the advanced variety, but the legacy, which makes it likely that any equipment using a semiconductor, which includes machinery control systems, pumps, lighting circuits, things used in normal applications in the military, are likely to have Chinese parts. Measures such as stockpiling will have limited value. This approach assumes that we know which materials are likely to be most critical, have some idea of what wartime or other emergency demand would look like, and require storage of material in a way that ensures readiness for use. Such stockpiling can be effective in reducing vulnerability, but it is limited by our ability to forecast exact demand. However, some actions can be taken. First, someone must be in charge of government policy and response. Every cabinet-level agency in the U.S. government has some kind of supply chain center that is focused on threats of concerns to that agency. This is understandable given the range of complicated threats, but the proliferation of organizations has not resulted in and may have hampered a coherent approach across the government and private sector. Lack of coherence results in poor appreciation of systemic threats. Second, cultural and organizational problems largely associated with a previous emphasis on achieving efficiency in peacetime must be overcome. These start with the recognition that there is likely to be inherent inefficiency in keeping material or capacity to produce material just in case. What might make sense for a business in steady state might not make sense when facing wartime demand. Third, emphasis must be placed on development of capabilities specifically designed to have a small logistics footprint. Equipment that requires extensive maintenance repairs with large numbers of highly trained people needed to operate and maintain it plays directly into Chinese strengths in supplying key material and increases our vulnerability to supply chain disruption. Finally, comparative advantages among trading partners apply in the DIB just as they do in other sectors of the economy. In some cases, allies and partners have resources that the United States simply lacks, such as some kinds of critical materials. In other cases, it will be simply more efficient for one nation to produce some commodities while others produce related commodities. Allies and partners serve as a means of gaining mutually beneficial investment in cases where pooled investments might have a better chance of generating both required capital and potential markets. As a broad conclusion, China is certainly the pacing threat, but remediation is less a matter of countering China than of addressing challenges that the United States has created for itself. Several things might improve the approach toward the execution of supply chain security in the DIB and elsewhere, but these may apply regardless of the adversary. The best approach to the current vulnerability is not to seek ways to punish China, it is to find ways to remedy a situation that the United States, in fact, largely created by itself. Thank you.
Thank you. I will evoke Chair's privilege and ask the first questions. Dr. Gorman, the scale of the challenge is vast and somewhat overwhelming. So can you help us orient ourselves towards the principles that we should be thinking through, both as it relates to prioritization of industries, but also as it relates to the potential responses that we might have to the challenges that we're seeing from China?
Sure, that's a big question. So I do think you actually hit on one of it, which is prioritization. We cannot do everything everywhere for every industry all at one time. So we are going to have to think through criticality. What are the most critical industries? I think some work has been done in this, but there is more work that can be done, particularly for the elements, and Dr. Martin touched on this as well, that may be upstream, might not be the leading tech, but at the end of the day, the product isn't going to work without them, whether it's for the defense industrial base or other critical sectors. So I think building on the work that's been done, trying to think through this issue of criticality and dependencies where the lack thereof would create critical issues for both our national and our economic security. There's another aspect here in terms of time, so prioritization on where we focus, but it's also when we focus and how much time it's going to take. There's some areas where we might be able to make faster progress quicker, whereas there are others that are going to take a number of years, but if we don't get started, we're going to be that much further behind. And so I think balancing those two is going to be really important as we start to look at where we're going to focus authorities and resources.
Thank you. Dr. Martin, anything to add to that?
Yes, we know something about what the demand for weapons and weapon systems are going to be in the event of a war. The place where we really need to focus in terms of the DIB is in the commodities that are essential to producing those types of things. We know a bit about it, but we don't know enough. What we know pretty well is that we can't react to surge. So the most pressing problem we have to deal with is surge for commodities that right now are only kept to a steady state level.
We're often responding to yesterday's problem. We are reactionary as opposed to anticipatory of the issue. Are there areas where you see an emerging threat where we are not focusing sufficient attention on currently? And conversely, do you think there are leapfrogging technologies that we should really be leaning into that could actually help some of the supply chain challenges that we are seeing now if we're sufficiently developing that technology?
I'm going to take the second question first. There certainly are leapfrogging technologies. It depends on which industry we're talking about, but take the pharmaceutical sector. There's continuous manufacturing. There are new biotechnologies that provide new ways to manufacture very important medicines. The challenge we have is scaling those, and it's kind of this perpetual challenge we've had in the United States for a while where we have the technology, but we need the patient capital, we need the time, and we need the investment to actually scale them to commercial level. There's also going to be trade-offs. We can't do it for everything. So I think starting to prioritize, determining where investment in those new technologies will help to get us there would be a start. There's other industries, but that is the one that I know best, so I'll leave it there.
When we start talking about scaling, we have to think about what we think we would face in the event of a conflict. That's thinking future. That's thinking about what we think we're going to have to fight in the next war. The thing I think has become clear is that we have no idea how vast the demand for munitions, for spare parts, for those types of things are likely to be in the event of a major war with somebody like China. We have examples right now that we can draw on. We should be drawing on those to try to understand better how we can be prepared. I'll give you an example. Nobody expected Ukraine to go through as many artillery shells in the time that it went through artillery shells as it did. There were more artillery shells used in a month than we had previously produced in a year. Now we're trying to expand that type of production, but why did we end up in that position? Well, it was because we weren't thinking clearly about what the next conflict might look like. Right now, we have put ourselves into a fairly serious jam when it comes to ordnance that might be needed in the Western Pacific. The volume that we could generate, the ability to meet the search demand there is not anywhere near sufficient. So that, to your point, what should we prioritize and what should come first? I mean, these seem like very clear priorities that we should be trying to deal with right now.
Thank you. Commissioner Miller.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Dr. Gorman, I'd like to ask you about something you wrote about in your testimony, which is the SCALE tool at the Department of Commerce. You note all the things the tool can do, which is utilizing various data sources that are available. But you also outline what it can't do. And the major problem, which you do highlight, is that this is based on sort of publicly available data and not what private companies are doing. When the SCALE tool is being created, I don't know how much insight you can give into this, what type of thought was there into requiring private companies to track their own supply chains? Why didn't it happen? Was it cost? Was it the priorities over supply chains is still not there to be able to sort of bulldoze companies into doing what they don't want to do? What was the thought process into doing it the way it was done, as opposed to the more thorough way requiring private companies to do the hard work?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think some of it was just what's the data that is available, because we need to build a tool, and there's a lot of data that the government sits on today that was not being analyzed. And I think we find that in multiple agencies. We need to use the data we have. SCALE is a start. It can certainly be expanded, and other agencies also have data that's not even feeding into SCALE right now. There was discussion. I mean, I was sitting at the White House working with the Commerce folks. There was discussion, but the authorities to compel that data are relatively limited and typically sort of situation dependent. So during the public health emergency, there were options for HHS, for example, to compel additional data. There was also a bit of a bully pulpit where HHS could work with the distributors for the supply chain control tower because we wanted to make sure medical supplies got to where they needed to go. But when you're not in a crisis situation, the interest of companies to do that dies down. And I can talk through sort of why companies think the way they do, but the reality is they hold that data. They don't understand why the government's going to use it. The government doesn't really have systems to receive it. And so it becomes very complex very quickly. But I think, as I said in my testimony, because companies sit on that data, exploring those public-private partnerships is going to be really crucial for us to get to the next level of this work.
Okay. And to follow that chain, when you were looking at chemicals and the key starting materials, which are not available in any of the public data, was there a debate about whether the government should go deeper on this, or because it seems like there's one of the things that this hearing is highlighted is how it is completely insufficient to just look at APIs or to look at final products. The key sourcing materials are really the key to understanding what our underlying vulnerabilities are. They're not present in the SCALE tool. They can only be done by private companies. Was this something that was talked about back and forth, but again, it was a matter, there's just not enough political pressure, not enough political prioritization at the time to be able to let policymakers know exactly how important these key starting materials are in the entire process, supply chain process? Yeah,
it certainly was discussed more in the context of work around pharmaceutical supply chain specifically, as opposed to in the SCALE tool. I think SCALE looked at chemicals writ large, but the HTS schedule doesn't allow you to distinguish at that level when it comes to KSMs. And I think HHS has said in a variety of ways, and certainly there were a lot of policy discussions around the need for this, but that would require additional authorities. And amongst the many, many priorities that were debated at the time, that was not one that came forward. But I think as some work was done and the need became more clear, that remains an opportunity that hopefully can get taken up by the current administration and folks who are focused on it, because it is not an area that was explored as much as it should have.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Martin, you mentioned labor being a topic that the Commission should be tracking more closely, and I appreciate that you highlighted that, because it's a word that hasn't actually been talked about that much today in any of the panels. Can you give us a little more insight into what labor shortages are most critical in terms of the defense industrial base? What are we missing here?
We are very short of workers for shipyards. I mean, that's an obvious place where we could start. That there are ships that are way behind schedule and delivery. There are ships that aren't being maintained properly, largely because we don't have the labor to do it. Now, that is a supply chain problem in the sense that you can't complete the work without the people to do it. However, other places, we have difficulty we're going to have difficulty meeting reshoring semiconductor in any big way because of the training levels of the American industry. We recently did a workshop with people from the chemical industry. Their indication is they have a very difficult time getting not so much PhD chemists as people who are qualified to do the technical work, the less sophisticated but still essential work. Another example is even in quantum computing, we have heard that they got plenty of people in labs. I mean, plenty of people is obviously exaggeration, but there are people in labs who are capable of working on the most advanced stuff. Where we have real problems are at the level of the factory level. We would have a hard time establishing that type of supply chain because we just don't have the trained people to do that type of work.
Okay. Thank you.
Commissioner Freeberg.
Thank you very much. Dr. Martin, if I could start with you. It seems to me that we're, last 5 years or so, we're trying to come to grips with the consequences of the convergence of two trends. One is the ongoing change in the character of the American economy, and in particular of our manufacturing capacity and our increased dependence on China for so many manufactured goods. And the other, and this I think is something that's grown since the Ukraine war, is the recognition of the continued plausibility of scenarios of protracted high-intensity conventional warfare. Is that an accurate description of the problem, would you say? It's those two things coming together?
I think that's a very accurate way to describe it. The U.S. economy continues to evolve, and people move into what they move into, and industries move around, and capital moves where capital is going to go. We are still dealing with a situation, though, where the ability to use military force and the ability to credibly conduct a deterrent, carry out a deterrent, depends on the ability to produce a certain amount of advanced manufacturing type of capability. That advanced manufacturing capability has migrated out of the United States, and more to the point, even if we could get parts of that back, the precursor materials that go into that are coming from other places. We've only lately started to really think about the dilemma that you're talking about, and I think the way you've described it is a very accurate way to portray where we are.
So it would seem that in order to deal with this, you'd have to start, as you said, with some kind of estimate of what the demands would be of a scenario like this, the demands for weapons and munitions and so on, and then you'd sort of work backwards.
Yes.
What would be the capacity for producing those things, and then what materials would you need in order to make those things, and so on. Is there any place in the U.S. government where anything resembling such an assessment is underway?
No.
Okay.
No, to be blunt, I mean, clearly the military has planners that are worried about what the munitions expenditure is likely to be and what the spare parts expenditure is likely to be. The connection between what's planned and what might happen and how the defense industrial base is aligned is not there.
And also the problem would be it's not just the defense industrial base, it's the whole industrial base.
That is correct.
Okay, so we're even further away from that. The Defense Department may be doing the tip of the spear, but nobody is doing the larger.
The further back you go, the worse it gets, yes.
Okay, so Dr. Gorman, on this score, it seems that you're describing the need for a mechanism which would be at the peak of the federal government pyramid,
yes,
presumably at the White House level, and which would have two kinds of tasks. One would be this sort of panoramic assessment of supply chains and vulnerabilities on the one hand, and the other would be the coordination of the tools that would be needed in order to create some of the capacity to fill those gaps. Is that an accurate description of what you're prescribing?
Yes, that is an accurate description. I appreciate that the National Security Council right now is undergoing some changes, so how that actually plays out, we have yet to see. But right now, the lack of coordination across the government really creates an incoherent approach to the problem which you described.
Thank you.
At some level, all these efforts do need to become brought into a point where coordination is taking place.
Dr. Gorman?
Yeah, so I would agree with that. And I think a lot of this has been the learning curve over the last 4 years as we saw agencies start to build agency-level capabilities, and then this proliferation, Dr. Martin touched on that as well. There was some legislation for a while that envisioned maybe the Department of Commerce would be first amongst equals and coordinate, but the reality is Department of Commerce is not going to tell the Department of Defense what to do on supply chains, so it really is likely going to be needed to be a centralized function, and it's assessment, it's strategy, and then it's execution. It's actually getting it done.
So it would seem that the White House Council on Supply Chain Resilience, in a way, is a sort of skeleton of that, an ad hoc or not quite ad hoc grouping that brings together people from all those relevant bureaucracies. Would you agree that it will be necessary to have something that is more permanent and established, some kind of mechanism at almost the NSC level or National Economic Council level to perform those tasks on an ongoing basis?
Yes, absolutely. I think it should be permanent. It should be institutionalized. There should be some level of continuity between administrations because these are long-term plays. Obviously, there's going to be a political leadership required for whichever administration, but it doesn't happen in 4-year chunks, and that's partly how we got here. So we do need something permanent and institutionalized.
I just note that that's something that the Commission has recommended 2 years ago.
Commissioner Goodwin.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and my appreciation to both the witnesses. Obviously, we've been talking a lot in today's hearing about leverage and dependencies and vulnerabilities, and it strikes me that that's probably a two-way street. So curious as to what China's greatest vulnerabilities and dependencies are. I suspect those are fairly easy to identify based on what the party has said and what the party has done. But do challenges in data collection and analysis and our visibility into China's supply chains inhibit our ability to identify other vulnerabilities that may exist, number one? And number two, would two experts like yourselves speaking with folks in China trying to assess how the party is doing, identifying vulnerabilities and responding to them, what do you think their assessment is? What is, when, as some of the questions have been posed, what's the worst case scenario in the party's perspective?
Okay. China is very aware of its supply chain vulnerabilities and, in fact, is committed to the idea of vertical integration. And if you look at wherever a critical mineral, for example, is being mined, they'll have a company, they'll have interest in the port, they will transport the stuff on Chinese shipping, and they will get it to one of the 10 largest ports in the world, which are largely in China. So they're very well aware of this type of vulnerability. And they spend a lot of time thinking about how they could avoid being made vulnerable in the event of a crisis. They're aware of the Malacca dilemma. They think a lot about that type of thing. And so their worst case is something like something gets cut off, we can't export things, we're going to have to, we'll have to deal with the economic disruption. Their biggest vulnerability is that they have to export stuff. So somebody has to buy the things that they make. They've not made the transition from being an export-based economy to being one that's more internally balanced. So they would be hurt. If there were something came up between the United States and China and there's something beyond a trade war, some major sort of contingency, they would be hurt. But then it comes down to a matter of who can stand it longer. And we don't actually have the answer to that, but part of that, look at the difference in the way each country responded to COVID, and China locked down and more or less maintained order. The United States went a different, we didn't lose order, but we did go a different direction. So I think the answer is their vulnerability is the same as that. If we don't consume things, they've got a problem, but they have thought a lot about how they'll deal with this, and I don't think that we've matched that. Over to you, ma'am.
Yeah, I would underscore that. I think they have thought a lot about this, but their vulnerabilities are export-oriented. We certainly saw just with the drop-off in trade in April, China's exports didn't really decline. They just were diverted to other areas. I think we could see that at least as a short-term mitigating measure on their part. You asked in terms of lack of visibility into China, and that is a challenge, particularly on the government side and government data. If things are being wholly done within China, it's very difficult for us to know. But companies know, and I say that as somebody who used to oversee a global team, who had a team on the ground in mainland China. The companies know where things are coming from, and they know who their suppliers are, and those suppliers know who their suppliers are. And so that's where I think thinking about more opportunities for public-private collaboration with American companies who know where their things are coming from would help to provide some of that visibility that we don't have today.
And that is a nice follow-up on the question I'd asked during our second panel about proprietary information. A lot of these companies obviously might be sensitive to sharing precisely that sort of information with their competitors, with the government, with the public. So what sort of barriers in your experience exist? You talk about the scale tool that would, if not make it public in a newspaper, but would allow the government to assess it, share it agency to agency, and otherwise foster more visibility into these global value chains.
Yeah, so there's two questions in there. So agency to agency is one challenge, and then proprietary data from companies is a different one. Agency to agency, some of it is legal, some of it is institutional. I think, again, the FDA has collected a lot of information on the pharmaceutical supply chain base as part of its regulatory function. That data is not shared because it is considered business proprietary, confidential. It's not even shared within HHS. And it wasn't collected for supply chain purposes. But if there is a way to sort of build out a supply chain purpose that provides for legal sharing, both within the agency and across agencies, that would help. Because right now the agencies are bound by the purpose for which the data was collected. When it comes to corporate data, this is challenging because companies' concerns are legitimate. Again, speaking as somebody who served as a corporate executive, and from a government side, we tend to be thinking about things from such a high level that we may not fully understand why a particular company's supply chain looks the way it does. And so companies are going to be reluctant to share data without being able to explain that. They're going to be reluctant, understandably, to share data if there are problems that they're trying to tackle because they don't know what the government's going to do. We have a lot of enforcement power. And so I think being able to navigate some of those things and perhaps come up with a mechanism that allows for a safer space to share that for understanding purposes would help. Again, in a crisis, everyone rolls up their sleeves and works together, and we saw that with the supply chain control tower. But when you don't have the forcing function of a crisis, you need to come up with another mechanism to make sure all parties are clear on why the data is being used and what it will not be used for to drive that comfort level.
All right. Thank you. Thank you.
Commissioner Hodges? We're going to go to Commissioner Keiken, and then we'll come back to Commissioner Hodges.
Thank you very much for your testimony today. Really appreciate it. Dr. Martin, you had started down a road talking about quantum, and then you sort of wrapped up very quickly. It's an area where the commission made some recommendations last year. I don't remember the exact words of it, but basically it was to figure out like what supply chains look like and where the U.S. should make a active decision to sort of vertically integrate, just because of global supply chains and where the risk is. If we were to make sort of recommendations this year, how would you think about the quantum ecosystem, whether it's a workforce issue or a supply chain issue? We'd really just be interested in your views on that. And let me just sort of couch it in this way, that at least the way I think about it is quantum is an area, at least with quantum compute, is an area where there's an incredible first mover advantage. And so, if there's places where where we should think about over-indexing the United States, this might be one of those places.
The quantum computing at the moment is heavily funded. Quantum computing at the moment is heavily featured in the academic setting. There are a lot of labs and so forth that are working very hard to make big advantages from that. The supply chains that would go with that are not well developed, and what has to happen in order for supply chains to develop is some decisions have to be made about what it takes to industrialize, to go from the laboratory into the field. And what that would imply is that somebody has to make a decision that this is the direction that the field is going to go, and that as a result, supply chains form around that. But the problem that I've identified has been that the supply chain for a bespoke type of product is going to be very vulnerable. So eventually, quickly, at some point, we're going to have to converge on the right technology, and I'm not going to try to say what that's going to be, but the right technology is decided upon, and from that, a market is established, and from that, supply chain naturally follows.
I'm going to try to translate what I think you said, which was there's a academic belief that there are multiple pathways to a quantum computer, thing one, and then thing two, that until there's sort of a clear pathway to whichever pathway ends up proving to be the most fertile, we don't know which supply chain to build. Fair read?
Well, it is, but the supply chain is established by the fact that a path is arrived at. Yeah. People are buying the product, and as a result, the supply chain can follow from that. But nobody's going to invest in supply chains for 15 different products.
Dr. Gorman, I saw you nod your head. Do you have anything to add there?
Yeah, I mean, I generally would agree with that, and I think it's one of the challenges we face more generally is that if we wait until the market is established, and that's a significant advantage that China has, because China says we're going to establish this market and we're going to invest in it even when we're losing money until we build it to scale, and by that time, the market's already established by the time we start investing. So that is one of the fundamental challenges.
I love the way you put that. That was actually perfect. Thank you. I'm going to ask Dr. Martin, just because I heard you mention shipbuilding, but Dr. Gorman, please chime in. You clearly have a ton of expertise in this space. So shipbuilding, do we need more workers, or do we need more, you were talking about welders, I think, Dr. Martin. Do we need more human welders, or do we just need to develop robot welders? And I ask this question because as we sort of look at, the conflict in Ukraine, as we look towards 2027 in a prospective Taiwan conflict, and you sort of think about, modernizing the U.S. Military, I sometimes wonder, is the question, should we have more sort of aircraft carriers and more large ships, or do we need more smaller ships that can do more things? Do we need to think more about autonomy? Do we need to think more about semi-autonomous systems? And then that sort of leads the question into manufacturing, which is in the manufacturing space, do we need people, or do we need robots, or what do we need? And the Commission's heard a lot about this over the course of this year. Liza Tobin was at the hearing that Commissioner Shriver and I co-chaired, where she had actually a pretty powerful story to tell about advanced manufacturing. And one of the stories she told, which I did not fully appreciate, was the story of KUKA Robots, which is this incredible robot manufacturing company that basically had a hostile takeover out of Germany into China. So it was an extraordinary story. Welcome your reactions to the sort of narrative, and see what you think. And both of you, please.
Certainly robotics will play a role in future industrial production, and that needs to be understood and exploited. For a while, however, for a significant period, there's going to be a need for skilled human workers to do the work that you need to carry out on, for example, ships. So it's a cost-benefit type of thing. There are times when it's going to be better to have a person rather than a robot. There's other times where clearly the best path is to rapidly automate. And then with your question about what force design ought to look like, we've looked at that a lot. Big, sophisticated, really complicated things are hard to maintain. We do need to be thinking very hard about a larger force of highly automated types of things that are more readily dispersed.
If I may add, I agree. I think it's robots, it's also people, but there's a cost calculation here too. The more you automate, the more upfront investment there is in capital, and the more you also are doing it differently. So the qualification process for those parts, if you're using advanced manufacturing, is different. That takes time. That also, you're against the inertia of the existing industrial base. And so you need more money up front, more capital, more attention to automate more quickly, whereas it's cheaper if you can do it with more people, but maybe not the best bet in a long time. So those are the types of decisions that we are going to have to wrestle with as we think about the future of the DIB.
So I think I heard you say change is hard and do both.
Yes.
Okay.
Chair Price.
Thank you. Dr. Gorman, I'm going to go back to the pharmaceutical issue. And you addressed some of this in your verbal testimony, some in your written testimony, and some just now in answering some of the questions. But I'm going to be redundant and ask again. Using the pharmaceutical issue, and you specifically talk about lack of data, could you talk what we're missing, what you are suggesting we do to fix it?
Sure. So the FDA has quite a bit of data on who makes what, from APIs forward. So APIs, finished dose product, et cetera. FDA does not have volume data. So a finished dose manufacturer may report 3 different API manufacturers, but the FDA doesn't know where the APIs are actually coming from. FDA does not have key starting material data. So the API manufacturers know. They know where they're getting their stuff from, but the finished dose manufacturer may not know, and if they do know, that it's not something that they have to report to FDA. So I think there's a volume question to better understand the actual production, not just what could be. And then there's also more upstream elements that we need to understand. And in addition to KSMs, you also have excipients and other ancillaries that may not be key to the medicine itself, but they're key in terms of how it's delivered or how you keep the medicine stable. Those are sort of the nails and the widgets that we have in other types of manufacturing that we don't think about, but you can't deliver the drug without it. And so that's another area where FDA is really lacking in data, and ideally would be an area that would be looked at.
So what do we need to fix to get what we need?
Volume data, ask for volume data reporting, and then mandate additional data upstream.
Does it go through FDA or goes through someplace else in government?
So it's a good question. I think FDA has systems set up today to collect this kind of information. They also have the relationships with the companies to do that. That is difficult to replicate quickly elsewhere. So it's probably the most obvious place to start. But going back to some of the earlier discussion, you don't want the data only to live there if you're looking at it for supply chain purposes. And even within HHS, you have multiple aspects of the pharmaceutical supply chain, really end to end, of FDA is the regulator, ASPR, which has money through its industrial base office to invest in US manufacturing, and then CMS, which sets reimbursement patterns and can really sort of signal on the demand side what is important. There's a real opportunity even within HHS to think end to end, and how do we use that ability at both ends of the supply chain to start to drive stronger incentives towards resilience.
Thank you. Dr. Martin, you highlighted lots of issues that we have. What's your top suggestion? We have to do X to fix some of these things.
The top suggestion would be to think seriously about the problem of surge. Surge is the most difficult problem that we have because we don't know how to deal with a crisis. And we are accustomed to the idea that if there is a crisis, if we scramble around enough and we spend enough money, we'll be able to fix it. But the truth of the matter is we no longer have that type of industrial capability. And I'm talking about surge being an issue across a variety of commodities, not just in the DIB, but pharmaceuticals are another example. If we have a war with China, or a significant reduction in trade with China, would not be able to react to increased demand if that were to happen.
And where would that thinking sit?
Well, I'm happy to do it.
And we're doing it here, right?
No, I think that this comes back to the national body that we were talking about, the integrating body that resides at the level of the president. and the president's staff, because this is across the whole of government, the whole of nation. It's that type of issue. We're right now, we are where the United States was in 1948 when it was looking at how is it going to deal with national defense, which resulted in the National Security Council, all variety of different ways of dealing with the problem. We don't have a comparable thing right now for the type of environment we're in. That's the body that would do this.
Yes.
Just to add to that, I agree with the need for coordinating, but there's also accountability and attention. And in this space, more than any other, it feels like as soon as the crisis passes, everybody forgets, moves on to something else. And that's part of what got us here in the first place. So congressional accountability for, if a body were established, having regular accountability to Congress to report on what is being found to ensure that that attention continues in the executive branch and the focus remains even when we're not in a crisis situation.
Thank you very much.
Vice Chair Shriver.
Thank you. Very much appreciate the witnesses and appreciate being educated by you. I'm going to yield my time to my colleagues who are much smarter than I am on these issues.
Commissioner Slavin.
Okay. Thank you both again, and I don't want to be redundant to some of the topics that have been covered. I guess I'd want to go back again to what you both have spoken well on, just the interagency soup, I call it, and the lack of coherence you both have discussed. Folks who have watched 8-year-olds play soccer, there's that aspect of everyone running towards the ball, and having come out of an agency, I say that with having participated in some of that stuff. But if we agree that the White House counsel, picking up on Commissioner Friedberg's observation, that the White House counsel is kind of where the consensus is built and forced, take us a step further. What's the action that you would outline, the punch list, not to a specific sector so much, but like if you can just take us a step further as to like what would you see if in terms of we're past the reports, we're past the data, we have all the information, what are like some of the steps you'd see moving forward?
Sure. So I would characterize the council as a start. It brought together the right people. It was established by executive order. But the council, the cabinet members alone are not going to do this. It's going to happen at deeper levels within the agency, and it's going to happen, it has to happen on a near daily basis. So there needs to be some body below the council, if you will, that is permanent, that continues that focus, that makes recommendations to the council. In addition, there's got to be some strategy behind it. And that, I think, comes from some sort of reporting requirements in terms of reporting on critical sectors, reporting on even what constitutes criticality, what are the sort of factors that we think of to define which our critical sectors are, because those change over time. We've seen changes just in the last 4 years. Continuous updating of that, continuous or regular reporting in terms of what the issues are, and then not just what the issues are, but what can be done about them. And from my time in government, that was actually one of the most challenging, was saying, okay, now we know what the issue is, but what are we going to do about it? There's a lot of smart people who can come up with good ideas, but they need to sort of be focused on that and not pulled in whatever the other crisis of the day is. And so I think establishing a framework that requires that focus, or institution focus, and then ongoing accountability in terms of what the issues are, what the assessment is, and then what can be done about them would hopefully start to drive some momentum.
Thanks. Dr. Martin?
Broadly defined, the largest national security problems that we deal with right now, which are not confined strictly to the national security problems that we're discussing, are broader. They deal with economic issues as well as with, the access issues, those types of things. Define what that problem is. What is the most likely thing that we think we're going to have to deal with? From that, extrapolate, or actually it's not really extrapolating, but it's moving backward toward what vulnerabilities are created, what's being done, who's responsible for dealing with those vulnerabilities, and are those vulnerabilities being addressed, or are they even identified? I'd start with that. I'd take a year to do it, and then I would say that what this tells us is our biggest challenges are wherever they are. And from there, you can start having agencies moving forward in a fairly cohesive way. as it is now, we wait for a crisis, we react, we create a task force to deal with the crisis, but we need to have some regular planning, and that's what this organization would do.
Agreed. And the national security concerns could be a slow burn until you realize they're right in front of you. I'll yield back the rest of my time. Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Stivers.
Thank you all for being here. I'd like to talk more about data. A lot of the discussion we've had is about data collection, you know, how and our policy and your policy recommendations that you put forward on incomplete supply chain data, lack of coordination between departments and agencies in the government and between the private sector and the government in general. Certainly, supply chain data information is essential. Of course, it's an obvious thing to say. But I feel like we do have a sense of what our supply chain vulnerabilities are and how we're dependent on China and how others in the world are dependent on China. Certainly in the broad frames, we do have that information, maybe not some of the specific data that you're referring to in your testimonies. And it seems the breakdown in our response is less about the lack of data and more about lack of resolve, a painfully slow policy process, and innovative responses. You all are a lot more sophisticated on these issues than I am, so I'd like you to help connect the two. In what ways are lack of data holding back specific policy responses that could help us convince Congress about the need to invest and prioritize data to move the policy process along?
So some thoughts on that. We definitely have a broad sense of where our vulnerabilities are. What we are lacking right now is when you specifically get into industries and start to drill into those industries, it's some of the nuances which on the face of it may not seem as important, but when you get down into the incentives and the behavior of the folks playing in that market, they become very important. So just in the chip space, a lot of attention focused to leading edge, but then China dominates in terms of legacy chips. And we've got to think about the incentive structure to ensure that they don't dominate in terms of legacy chips. I think you see that in multiple industries, and maybe where there's opportunity is to drill into specific industry data to better understand the market dynamics so that we can start to change the incentives in structure so that the actors are working towards different incentives, which ideally drives them away from China and towards a more resilient sourcing model.
We don't know what we don't know. So we may think we appreciate what the broad challenges are, but I'm not sure that we actually have a really good sense of where the vulnerabilities lay. But I don't think that studying it to death is necessarily the right answer either. And there are some cases where exposure of data is just going to tell us, well, yeah, we're exposed. So what I think what we do have to do is recognize the incentive structures are what really drive how people behave within supply chains. We need to understand that we're trying to create a collective good situation. We're saying supply chain security, economic security is something that we all value, but the individual actors within the process are not going to value it that much because free rider, the whole type of thing that goes with the provision of a collective good. So I think that what we probably need to spend a lot of time thinking about is how do we create the correct incentives to do things like prepare for surge. There is no natural incentive for a company to prepare for what could happen, maybe in a disaster. There's a propensity to want to do it on a, but what works on a daily basis is where the focus is. So I think we have to recast our thinking about it. We don't necessarily need to go into great depth about every supply chain. We just need to know how to make people act in a way that's going to create a secure one.
Okay. So, thank you.
Mr. Hodges.
Hi, good afternoon. So I was reading one of your testimonies this morning, and according to an industry study, 71% of industries source more than 70% of imports from China and Russia. And yet when I look at sort of the efforts that are being coordinated and prioritized, we're focusing heavily on military supply chains. In your perspective, while that's extremely important, I'm sure we all agree, how dangerous is it for us to just ignore other future tech? And how can we, this gets kind of to your last point, sir, is incentivize the structure where we're pursuing those things that we think are going to be there in the future that are actually going to have a tangible impact on our lives here if we go to war for whatever reason, that are currently putting us vulnerable because we have all this material coming in that it's coming from adversaries.
I mean, Dr. Martin is the expert on the DIB more so than I am, but there are significant vulnerabilities, and I think he touched on this as well. Just if you think about the DIB, because of the dependencies on commercially available products. And so I think what we learned during COVID is not understanding where those commercial dependencies are really can have an impact on both economic and national security. And so I think that is partly why this work is so important, and broadening the definition of national security is critical, because there are key military hardware that are dependent on commercially available things that we may or may not make in the United States. And so continuing to understand that, shining a light on it, they're not always the coolest products, the most advanced products, but it's for want of a nail, the kingdom was lost. There's that old poem. Sometimes that nail is absolutely crucial, and we need to know what those are.
You're absolutely right that focusing exclusively on the DIB is a mistake. I believe it stated that the weaknesses that we see in the defense industrial base reflect weaknesses in the broader economy. And trying to fix the problem by focusing specifically on the things that are DIB specific, I think is a good way to continue to create problems. With that said, the incentive structures are what drive behavior. China is the major supplier of manufactured equipment to the United States for a reason. I mean, to the world for a reason. It's because of the way they set the incentive structure up. We set up an incentive structure that rewarded migrating industry and supply chains to China, and we're seeing the result. This is not going to get fixed overnight, but I completely agree with you that the only way at this is to figure out why people buy things the way they buy things and produce things the way they produce them.
Thank you for that. I think it's worth noting that China also accomplishes the dominance that they've achieved at taking losses through what they're investing in, because they do see a strategic interest in the long term to do so. So thank you for your testimony, very valuable.
Great, thank you. Any additional questions from commissioners? Kaiken?
I'd never turn down a second round. There's a third panel, we're doing a second round. Dr. Gorman and Dr. Martin, as I was listening to you guys, one of the things I remembered was a colleague of mine in the Schumer operation and I tried to set up like a supply chain shop of some sort in the Department of Commerce while we were building out Chips and Science. And there were only a few times where my email inbox like exploded with anger and rage. And I vividly remember this being one of them. And the pushback from industry at the time was, we don't want to be compelled to give you anything, you being the government broadly, like Uncle Sam. We're happy with voluntary requirements. And there was a lot of just pushback in this space. What you're suggesting is basically going to have a lot of backlash from industry, probably in every sector. So how should we think about this, recognizing that challenge? And how do we sort of craft something that accomplishes what you both seem to be advocating for, but at the same time doesn't create this sort of adversarial relationship between industry and the government? And listen, I get it. If you're a company that's reporting quarterly profits and you're being compelled to hand over data, or you're being compelled to shift your supply chains that increase costs and brings down your quarterly profits, like that's not a very appealing arrangement for you. So you guys have clearly done a lot more thinking than I have in this space. So just sort of walk us through how you would sort of knuckle through this policy challenge.
Yeah, I can certainly understand the reaction of industry. And on the one hand, is government even equipped to deal with all of the potential incoming that would come from companies? I'm not sure the government is or even should be. So that's where I wonder, could the discussions focus more on incentives? And there certainly are players in certain industries who would talk more fully about what would be the types of incentives that would potentially shift behaviors. There's also, and I touched on it briefly in my written testimony, but thinking about how our markets work, and are there other incentives, including in, say, the financial markets, to think about companies stress testing their supply chains and understanding where their vulnerabilities are. We saw a number of our companies surprised by the COVID shocks. Ideally, and that is real risk, there's real cost to that, but the market doesn't price that in right now. And so would there be ways to even think about how the market could start to price some of these risks to help companies think about it? There is a short-term cost potentially if you're holding more inventory or you're dual sourcing. But if you could accurately price the value of doing that in a shock scenario, maybe the market would reward it more. So I do think there are some innovative ways that we could start to think about the incentive structures, including how business works, and ideally start to build some of that into business planning.
So the part I couldn't figure out as I was listening to you is, what's the incentive? Are they getting a reward? Are they getting, like, is it like my dog? Is he getting a treat? Like, I'm not understanding what the incentive is if you're a company, right? It seems like, it sounded very appealing. It sounds like you're still compelling the government. You're still compelling a company to potentially give over information to the government that they don't want to give up.
You could potentially see reporting around supply chain metrics. So there's been some academic work, some great work, but it's still somewhat preliminary on measuring supply chain risk. So what's your time to recover in the case of some sort of exogenous shock? What's your time to survive if certain parts of your supply chain system were taken down? Those are the types of metrics that you could start to think about. Imagine if Wall Street analysts were asking, what is your TTR? What is your TTS? Like, imagine if that was part of the reporting that companies did and did as part of their planning. You're not compelling them any particular way to set up their supply chain, but you are asking them to think about what would be the cost and the impact if there were shocks.
It seems like the most natural way to do that would be creating a requirement for the SEC to ask that kind of information of people in their, whatever the number of the report is, the 1720 or the 1902 or whatever it is.
Yeah, and it would be worth, I mean, this is an area that I think should be explored much more deeply than this brief conversation, but I think there is some opportunity there to build in supply chain resilience thinking and measurement into how companies are evaluated on their balance sheets.
Thank you, Dr. Martin. Any views?
Yes, compelling companies to give things is going to be a losing proposition. They'll find ways to get around it. They'll be irritated. You'll get nasty emails. I mean, it's not, that's probably not the right approach. However, what we are talking about is how do we provide something that's collectively good that everybody's going to benefit from, that no one individual is going to benefit from on their own. So the types of incentives you have to create are, first off, we have to say publicly, we've created a situation where we're trying to fix what we view as a national problem, and we need your help. That actually can carry some weight. Another part of this is to say, we're not using this data, the data we ask for is anonymized or whatever, we're not trying to use this in a regulatory framework. We're using this as economic data in order to analyze where we think vulnerabilities might be. It can be facilitated by there being normal arrangements, normal meetings, normal discussions between industry and this big organization that we're talking about. I mean, everybody loves meetings, of course, but what I'm really discussing is establishing a environment of trust is probably part of this whole discussion. Compulsion and then saying, give me these buckets of data and I'll go analyze it is a bad practice. It wouldn't work.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Anyone else? All right. Well, with that, I would like to thank our witnesses for their excellent testimony. Testimony will be available as well as the recording of the hearing on our website. And with that, we are adjourned.